My name is Don Paine. Today is December 15, 2003. I'm in Knoxville, Tennessee to interview Bernie Bernstein. This is part of the Legal History Project of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. Bernie, why don't we start by having you give us, for the record, your full name and your date of birth, please.
Bernard E. Bernstein, and I was born on February 3rd, 1931.
And where were you born?
Newark, New Jersey.
Tell me a little bit about your parents and your background up there in New Jersey.
Well, both of my parents were born in what was then called Hungary, and emigrated to the United States and lived in Newark and had 3 children. I have an older sister and I have a twin sister, and lived in Newark until I went off to college and really never went back. And
what did your father do for a living for the family?
my father started out as a cabinet maker, and then got involved in construction and was a construction supervisor the last years of his life.
And your mother?
Mother was a housewife, died very young. She was 56 years of age.
I've been told that you were the first in your family to go to college. Is that correct?
Yes, I was a Depression baby, and I was the first one that went to college.
And when you went to undergrad school, what was your field of study then?
Well, I went to the University of Pennsylvania, and I was in the Wharton School of Business, and graduated in 1952 with a bachelor's degree in economics.
And did you use that for a while to make a living, or did you decide to go further?
Uncle Sam had other plans for me, and I graduated in the morning, got commissioned in the afternoon, and I was in the Air Force for over 2 years right thereafter, during the Korean War and after the Korean War.
Over the years, we've talked briefly about your service time, and the other day we talked in more detail. Why don't you tell us, for the videotape, something about what you did? I realize when we get into it, by the nature of your service, there are some things you won't be able to talk about, but tell us what your service years were made up of.
It was an interesting experience. I was selected, apparently, for an organization called the Office of Special Investigations, and we had the responsibility for major criminal investigations, counterintelligence, personnel security, procurement fraud. And I was assigned to an area in the Midwest at an air base called Chanute Field, and I was there, and I was in Scott Field, and we were trained in Washington generally by FBI instructors. It was structured in the same way as the FBI. And as the Korean War was winding down, I was told that I was going to go to Korea to head up a team of agents, as we were called, special agents, to interrogate American Air Force prisoners of war that would be returning from North Korea. The world has forgotten this, but the American Air Force pilots who were shot down over Korea were accused of dropping germ warfare bombs. And as a result, the Koreans and the Chinese communists were very anxious to get confessions, and they literally beat the confessions out of the American pilots. And when the war ended and the American Air Force prisoners came through the lines, they were in such bad physical shape that they had to get them to hospitals as soon as possible. So instead of our agents flying to Korea to interrogate them, we brought the prisoners of war home to the United States, and they were put in hospitals as close to their homes as possible. And we then interrogated them, trying to determine exactly what happened during their term in prison, as well as positive intelligence information. And we were also concerned about the 22 Americans who decided not to return. And that was a great concern to us. And I headed up a team of interrogators, and we worked on that virtually every day for 6 months. And I would spend half the night dictating intelligence reports based upon the interrogations. And we used court reporters all day long, running them in and out and getting the information that we wanted. It was like taking depositions every day for 6 months.
So even though you weren't a lawyer at that point in your career, you were doing some work similar to legal work in that sense?
Oh, I think very much so. Very much so.
Did that have any effect, you think, or influence on your ultimate decision to study law?
Well, it had an interesting effect because when I was at the Wharton School, I thought I would go on to law school right after graduation. Then the war came along, and I was due to be in service. And by the time I left the Air Force, I was really worn out. It was a very, very trying experience. I lost all my hair, and I remember going up to Columbia Law School to talk about perhaps enrolling there, and I saw the young students, young meaning they were 2 or 3 years younger than me, and I just couldn't see myself sitting in a classroom with them and pontificating about aspects of the law after what I had done, and I just couldn't do it. And it took me a few years before I could get in the right frame of mind to consider going to law school, and that's what I did.
In your childhood, in the teenage years, did you know lawyers who were people maybe that were folks you wanted to emulate?
I didn't really know any practicing lawyers. I knew people who had been lawyers, but because of the Depression, didn't practice.
I see.
And would often talk to me about their disappointment in not practicing law.
Well, how did you then eventually end up studying law formally and becoming a lawyer and practicing?
Well, I started out going to NYU Law School at night. I was working for a company in New York and doing a lot of traveling around the country. And I just wanted to see if I could handle law school. And it was a very interesting school, and I enjoyed it. And after 2 years of taking courses, I decided that I was going to get with the program and go through law school and finish and practice law. And at about that time, my wife and I became pregnant, and having a child living in a one-room apartment in Greenwich Village in New York was a little bit much. And she was from Knoxville, and she literally drugged me back to Knoxville. And I enrolled at the UT College of Law and finished up at UT.
So we're talking about Barbara Winnick. How did you and Barbara first meet?
Well, Barbara was visiting a friend at Sarah Lawrence College, and I had double dated with that friend, and she was dating one of my Air Force friends. And she asked me to take out her friend from Knoxville, who turned out to be Barbara. And it turned out we had a lot of interests in common, and she told me she was planning to come back to New York to work full-time in New York. And I told her if she did to call me, and she did. And then I told her if she got a job making $100 a week, I would marry her. And she called me back about 4 hours later and said she got the job, it was more than $100, and when do we get married? And I was a man of my word.
Right.
So about 3.5 months later, we got married.
That's wonderful. She had a lawyer in her background, did she not?
Yes, Barbara's father was a practicing lawyer in Knoxville for many, many years.
Was that Ben?
Ben Winnick.
Ben Winnick, yes. And what was the nature of his practice? I didn't have the pleasure of knowing him personally.
It was a general practice, a lot of business activities, business practice primarily.
And getting ahead a little bit, but I want to come back to the your rest of your legal education. But as a result of this marriage, I know 2 children were born. Tell us a little bit about the 2 children of you and Barbara.
Well, my firstborn child is Barry Bernstein, and she's a lawyer.
She's with us here today.
And she is the executive director of the Tennessee Bar Foundation. And my youngest child is Mark Bernstein, and he's a lawyer as well. And he lives in San Francisco and Atlanta, seems to commute between the two cities.
What did, of course, I know Barry, your daughter, well, you followed her career, but with Mark, what did he do with his law degree? Did he practice or do some other career?
Mark practiced with King and Spalding in Atlanta for about 4 years, and then left, and shortly thereafter went with CNN and was a senior attorney, and then went over into the business side of CNN and became a vice president and the manager of CNN Interactive, the internet operations of CNN. And then, as luck would have it, after several years in that position, he became president of a dot-com company. And the rest is history. He's now doing his own investing and consulting and so on.
That's wonderful. Picking up where you were told, you were drugged back to Knoxville at your wife's insistence. Then you enrolled in the University of Tennessee College of Law, did you not? And how long did you attend UT?
It was really about a year and 9 months. In those days, we were on a quarter system, and you went to school year-round, so I was able to get the required courses in very quickly.
So when would you have graduated there?
I graduated in December of 1958.
Okay. Took the bar, of course, and began practicing once you were licensed. Tell us something about your early days in practice. What was the nature of it? What sort of office arrangements did you have? What sort of clients and the like?
Well, I think there were about 10 students in my graduating class in law school, which is difficult to believe nowadays. And there were really no jobs. The best jobs available were to be adjusters for State Farm or Allstate or one of the other companies. And I guess it was just dumb luck on my part, but I decided to try it on my own. And I rented a room at the Hamilton Bank building for $22 a month and just put up a card table until I could buy furniture and everything else. And I was able to use the secretary down the hall for me in my father-in-law's office for a while, but I was able to hire a secretary after a few months, and people started to come to me, and I was kind of surprised, and before you know it, you have enough to do to keep you busy all day. And after about 6 months, I realized it was going to work. And then I had to decide if I really wanted to stay in Knoxville or not. And I'd had a very pleasant experience at the College of Law. We knew all the students. We knew the students, their wives, their children. The same thing was true of the faculty. It was a very collegial atmosphere. And we decided to stay in Knoxville. We bought a house and had a second child, and that was it.
Do you have any recollections about any early clients, first client, or any of those clients in the early years of struggling that stick out in your mind?
My best case, the first year I was in practice, was a fellow had Simonized my car, and he had an automobile accident and came to see me, and that led to a fee of about $1,500, and I was rich. And I would make it a point to walk around town and go to different places for lunch to meet people that I might know and so on. And people would know that I was a lawyer, and every once in a while you'd get a phone call or an inquiry. And a friend that was in business, I went to see him one day, ostensibly to buy a washer for a faucet at home that needed repair. And he wrote out a check for $100, and he says, "You're my lawyer. This is a retainer fee." And that $100 check served him very well in the years that followed, because he got terrific treatment as the first retainer client
That's good.
I ever had.
as we know, in the urban counties, 4 major cities in our state, it's typical for a lawyer to gravitate either to the trial end of practice or the so-called office practice. And within the trial, usually criminal versus civil, in contrast to the more general practice in the rural counties. But my impression, Bernie, has been that you have touched all the bases as far as types of practice. How did that come to be?
Well, I think hunger is a great teacher.
Yes.
And you must remember, this goes back 44 years when I started, and you took whatever you could find in the practice of law. As I indicated, there are very few young lawyers practicing. And Judge Baer, who was the bankruptcy judge, that was Clive Baer, called me one day and said, I need you down here to serve as a trustee in bankruptcy. Well, I didn't know what a trustee in bankruptcy was. But if a judge calls you, you ought to look into it. And so I looked into it, and for a number of years I was handling cases as a trustee at $5 per case. But every once in a while something better would come along. And I just took everything that came through the office door.
And you did a lot of bankruptcy over the years.
Yes, yes. The little cases turned into bigger cases. And
let's talk about some of the specifics of your career at the bar. And I want to concentrate primarily on some of the litigation you were involved in. Would it be fair to say that as time went on that you spent more of your time doing trial practice than purely office practice?
I think that's true.
One of the first cases I recall, and it may have been about this time that you and I first met, because I have this vision in my mind even today of coming in to the Hamilton Bank building and coming into the office where you were solo. And it seems like I was there because I had known of you as a result of your activities with the Gateway Bookstore, which was further down Gay Street from the office where we're sitting today. Tell us and the viewing audience here a little bit about the Gateway Bookstore case.
Well, the owner of the Gateway had been referred to me to review a lease that he had. And I did. And I remember my fee was $15, and it was a one-shot deal, and that was the end of it. And a few weeks later, I got a telephone call from him, and he said, I don't know what's happening. I'm in a phone booth across the street from my Gay Street store, but there's a raid going on. There are people who claim to be state agents, and they're going through the books and magazines in the store and carting them out. And they don't explain anything to my employees. What should I do? And I said, well, stay where you are, and I'll come down and look at it and find you. And I went down there, and sure enough, there were agents of the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, the TBI, going through the racks of books, and if it had sex in the title or if it had a nude female figure on the cover, they were seizing the book or the magazine and putting it in boxes. And when I asked them what authority they had, they told me they had all the authority they needed. When I mentioned the First Amendment to them, they said, you must be a communist. And they weren't prepared to talk to me at all. And furthermore, they wanted to know where the owner was because they needed to arrest him. And I then went and found my client and told him I couldn't explain what was happening, but it was indeed happening, and that we better go to the Attorney General's office and turn him in, which is what we did. And as a result of that raid, they seized 10% of the inventory of the store and carted the inventory off, and the store was closed for 2 days, I believe, and the client was prosecuted in criminal court. And as it would happen, an organization called the Citizens for Decent Literature, CDL,
I remember that.
volunteered to assist the Attorney General, and they sent in a man named Keating. And Keating was a special prosecutor, and we tried this case for a week.
He was from out of state, as I recall.
He was from
yes.
Cincinnati.
Right.
He's the same Keating that was later indicted in Arizona
Yes.
for the savings and loan scandal. But he was holier than thou, and it was a very hard-fought case in criminal court.
Was it? Were they prosecuting your client under the obscenity laws?
Yes, under the then existing obscenity law in the state of Tennessee. We felt that the law was unconstitutional and that we probably would lose it at the trial court, but we had our best chance of winning it in the Supreme Court of Tennessee. And that's exactly what happened. We lost the case in the trial court. It was appealed to the Supreme Court. We won the Supreme Court, and the obscenity law was set aside as unconstitutional.
Chronologically, would that be the first major case that you were involved in, would you say?
Yes. It was also a case that afforded me the opportunity to challenge the way criminal court was run in those days. There were no women on juries. There were no blacks on juries. And this was a paying client, and I filed motions to quash the indictment and filed motions to challenge the jury panel and tried to build a record, which I was able to do in that case.
Was Judge Bibb the sitting judge in those days?
Judge Bibb was the criminal court judge.
Yes, and I want to lead into another case that's a major case of yours, but tell us a little bit about the legal clinic that was at the University of Tennessee. How did that get started, and what was your connection with the clinic?
Legal aid clinic at the College of Law had been in existence for certainly since World War I, frequently run by students. And then I believe about 1948, Charles Miller was brought to UT from Duke, and he became the head of the legal aid clinic, and it became a course doing primarily civil litigation. And then about 1961 or 62, Charles Miller obtained a Ford Foundation grant to establish an effort, really, to teach criminal law practice to graduating seniors only. And I was asked to head up that program. And so it was a part-time appointment to the College of Law. And we took appointed cases, and the students worked on those cases, but I had to try them. So over a period of about 8 years, I tried, I would say, a half dozen or more murder cases and rape cases and all the other types of criminal cases that are possible. And I think it was a noble effort for the law school to do that because it came at the time of the Miranda case, when a revolution occurred in the practice of criminal law. And we were training students to be ready to go out and handle appointed cases in whatever cities they were practicing in.
And what was your motivation of wanting to get involved yourself with the clinic? Was it just because you were asked to do so and felt it was your obligation?
Well, it was a job, really. It was like having a client. I didn't get paid very much, and it was very challenging to be at the law school 2 afternoons a week and to work with the students on these cases. And, of course, trying the cases was time-consuming.
And one of the cases you and I have talked about, and a case for which you have been noted as a very, very able advocate, that would be the Greenlee murder case. Why don't you tell us how it came that you represented Mr. Greenlee?
Well, Mr. Greenlee was sitting in jail, and he was arrested for and charged with murder, knifing a young girl about 16 years of age, and he was about 21 at the time. And he was arrested and was held in city jail. And after about a week, he was brought to the Attorney General's office presumably to have a lie detector test administered, and he was urged to just go ahead and confess and avoid the hassle of being wired up, and he did. And the Attorney General helped him write out a confession. It was about 3 pages long, and he was then charged with first-degree murder, and notice was given that they're going to ask for the death penalty. And I was appointed to represent him. And when I met him and read the confession, I was just troubled because the confession was too good. He admitted to knifing this girl over and over and over again. You know, once is enough, but he did it many times. And I didn't think he really had the mental capacity to understand what was happening. And I was able to convince the head of the psychology clinic at UT to go into the jail late at night and to talk to this young man and give him some of the standard tests. And he did, and he called me the next day and he said there was no way this defendant could have committed this murder.
Now, in this case, pre-trial, were you again launching a challenge into the makeup of the grand jury and also the trial juries based on race and
Yes.
gender?
Yes. I mean, this was a murder case. They were asking for the death penalty, and we had to do everything we could to defend him.
Was Mr. Greenleaf white or black?
He was black.
Okay.
And the victim was black as well. And they offered him 20 years if he would confess. And his family urged him to confess, and he said he didn't do it and he wasn't going to confess, and that was good enough for me. And we filed a motion to challenge the grand jury makeup, denied. And we filed a motion to challenge the trial jury makeup, denied. And I was challenging it based on the fact that there were no blacks and no women. And the judge was very critical of us. He made it known that everybody in the world knew that blacks didn't like to sit on juries, and women couldn't sit on juries because they didn't have any facilities, no bathrooms for women jurors. And so in the course of putting on my case, I called the female clerks in the criminal court to testify as to where they went to the bathroom. The judge was very, very upset at that. He thought it was an unkind question. Well, of course, they did have bathrooms for women.
Sure.
And ultimately, in the Greenlee case, we got our first woman on a jury. And I like to think that she was helpful in arriving at the verdict.
And she actually sat on the trial jury?
She sat on that trial jury.
So what did happen at the trial once you finally got the proof going?
Well, we put in, the state started off with the confession and put in the physical facts, had the detectives testify, and we couldn't get rid of the confession. It was in. And then we put on the psychologist. And fortunately, the judge started to pick on the psychologist. And he was very good, and I think his testimony turned the day. And then we also discovered that the Attorney General, in his zeal to get the conviction, had put the wrong date in some of his notes. He purported to be reading from his notes. The Attorney General took the stand, which is right unusual.
Yes.
And he referred to his notes, and he had the year in which the trial was being held rather than the year in which the confession was given.
Oh, mercy, mercy.
So that looked rather questionable.
Right. Who was the district attorney at that time?
Clarence Blackburn.
Yes, I remember him. And again, Judge Bibb would have been the sitting judge.
Judge Bibb was a sitting judge. And the jury was out for a number of hours, and when they announced they were coming in to render their verdict, the judge ordered the sheriff to line the walls of the courtroom to prevent any outbursts. And we had about 10 sheriff's deputies come in, stand around the walls, and the jury found he was not guilty.
Amazing.
And we were thrilled to death, and we waited for him to be released by the jailers, walked through the courthouse to Main Street. He held a cab, got in the cab, and drove away, and we were left with our briefcases to trudge up the street, and we never saw him again.
Is that right? And was that, I take it, your first capital case?
Yes, that was my first. The end of that case is even more interesting.
Tell us about that.
Several years later, a man in Hialeah, Florida, saw a patrol car parked at someone's house. He went up, rang the doorbell. The woman answered, said her husband wasn't home, but he'd be back shortly. He said, well, can I wait outside? She said, yes. The patrolman, or the state trooper, I think it was, came back to the house, and this black young man said, I need to confess to a murder that I committed in Knoxville, Tennessee several years ago. It's been bothering me ever since. And he did. He was brought back to Tennessee. He pleaded guilty, and he was sent away. That's a very good argument against the death penalty.
That's impressive, really is. I know by my own recollection that for a while you were a lawyer willing to take some unpopular cases, and I do remember again when the Highlander school ran a summer camp. Tell us, if you would, briefly what happened as far as your involvement in the Highlander camp.
Well, I was not involved in the camp or the school or anything else, but the Highlander group here in Knoxville had a summer camp in the mountains on Rich Mountain, Smokies, and they had a group of children, both black and white, which was unusual in those days. And a lot of them came from the Boston area. They were the children of professors at Harvard and MIT. And they had this summer camp going on Rich Mountain, and they'd been observed, shall we say, by some of the people in that area to be doing things perhaps they shouldn't be doing, namely having black children and white children in the same tent. And the rednecks in the area let the sheriff's department know there was going to be trouble on the mountain one night. And the sheriff's office for Blount County went up there and observed that there were things going on that shouldn't be going on. So they raided the camp, and they found a bottle of liquor. And Blount County was dry. And one of the counselors had a bottle of liquor in his knapsack, apparently. And they took the counselors and the children, and some of the counselors had babies. I think there was 1 or 2 babies. They took the whole group of about 15 down to the jail, children and adults, put them all in the same jail, and while the children were in jail, the rednecks in the area burned the camp to the ground. And then they had to decide what to do with these people that were charged with disorderly conduct and some other charges that seemed strange. And the General Sessions judge and the juvenile court judge, sitting side by side, tried everybody at one time and found most of them guilty, which is most unusual and most unlawful.
Were you counseling?
No, I was
cases?
not involved in the trial at all. And several months later, an appeal was apparently filed. And then the students went back home to the Boston area, and the counselors went wherever they came from. And the case was pending on appeal, so to speak, to the circuit court or the criminal court. I think it was a circuit court back then. And I was called by the then former Attorney General of the state of Massachusetts, who was looking for a lawyer on behalf of the parents of these people to try to do something with this case. And he didn't really want me, he just wanted me to help him get a better-known lawyer. And I visited with some of the better-known lawyers and asked them to get involved, and they wouldn't get involved. He was stuck with me and asked me what could be done. And I said, well, I think we should pursue the appeal and try to win it on appeal. And lo and behold, the appeal was dismissed because there was an improper bond filed before I got involved in the case. So there we were with a decision of the circuit court that an appeal would not be allowed because of an improper bond. And we then filed an appeal to the Supreme Court, challenging the decision of the lower court to dismiss the case because of an improper bond. And it got to the Supreme Court for hearing about a year and a half after it happened, and the Supreme Court set it aside and said that substance prevails over form, that an effort was made to file an appeal bond, and even though the bond was made payable to the clerk of the court rather than to the state of Tennessee or something like that, they ought to have their day in court. So then we had a date scheduled for a trial. And of course, these students were now teenagers, and they didn't want to come back here for a trial. And I was able to work with some of the local folks in Blount County and convince the Attorney General to dismiss the case.
I see. Was that your first time you had an appearance in the sense of filing papers with the U.S. Supreme Court?
This was the Tennessee Supreme Court.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Tennessee Supreme Court.
Yeah.
No, I think I'd been to the Tennessee Supreme Court before. Again, in those days, every once in a while another lawyer would ask you to do something for him and pay you a fee. And I think I argued a case in the Court of Appeals the third week I was in practice on behalf of another lawyer. And I think I did the same thing in the Supreme Court. Remember, there was no criminal court of appeals in those days.
So criminal cases went straight to the Supreme Court.
Straight to the Supreme Court.
Yes, I see. Then there was a case you had in federal court involving another camp of sorts, a nudist or a colony, a nudist colony or nudist camp. Where was that, and what was that lawsuit about?
Well, that case probably had the most publicity because it conjures up visions of sex and so on. The legislature in the state of Tennessee became aware of the fact that there was a nudist camp somewhere near Knoxville. And with great hilarity and frivolity and so on, the legislature unanimously passed a law making it unlawful to engage in the practice of nudism in the state of Tennessee. And it was not a very well-defined statute. And it got a lot of attention in the paper and the press and so on. And about 2 months later, a man shows up at my office and explains that he's a lawyer from Washington and that he represents the American Sunbathing Association and wants me to represent the nudists that challenge the constitutionality of the state statute. I was sure that one of my friends had put him up to this, that this really wasn't a lawyer. And he told me he had 2 people ready to sit naked at a nudist camp and to be arrested. And he asked me what I would charge to represent him. And because I thought it was a joke, I told him a very sizable sum. And he said, well, that's fine. And he would see that I got the check. And then I was stuck. And I decided that there had to be a better way to do this than have 2 people arrested. And suppose I won it in the trial court, we'd never challenge the constitutionality. And so I did a lot of research and came up with the idea of using a 3-judge federal court. There was a statute that enabled you to convene a 3-judge federal court to challenge the constitutionality of a state statute. And that's what we did. And the Sixth Circuit sent Judge Harry Phillips down. And Judge Darr, who was a retired federal judge in Chattanooga, sat on the bench along with Judge Robert Taylor. And the American Sunbathing Association, which was footing the bill for this, publicized the fact that the trial was going to be held, and everything I wrote was printed and sent out to all their members. So people all over the country were reading our motions and our briefs and so on. And the day of the trial, the federal courtroom was jammed, and all the major news services were there. And there we were challenging the state law, and Deputy Attorney General Tom Fox came over from Nashville to represent the state of Tennessee. And we tried the case in front of the 3-judge court. And that night, Johnny Carson talked about the case on television. And the New York Times had a front-page article on it the next day, and Time magazine that week had an article, and the title was "Not His Cup of Tea." And that came from the fact that the night before the trial, I told my wife that I was ready to go, but I didn't have a good handle for it. She said, "Why don't you just stand up and tell the court that nudism isn't your cup of tea, but it might be somebody else's?" And that was the opening line, and everybody picked up on it.
Sure.
And the court rendered an opinion, and it's a very well-written, humorous opinion, holding that the law was unconstitutional.
I see. As a result of those, that trilogy of cases, were you criticized by the Knoxville community, or professional or otherwise?
No. As a matter of fact, I think I got more respect as a result of winning those cases. The only person that criticized me was a lecherous lawyer, well known for his lechery, and he criticized me.
Interesting. Well, we'll let that person's name go without putting it on the record. You were involved in some of the unrest over at the university, which I was familiar with because I believe that was back at the time I was a baby law professor. At least some of that went on. One matter involved some of the UT students over there supposedly being involved with disorderly conduct, and then there was the visit of then President Nixon to the UT Stadium. Why don't you tell us about those matters and your involvement?
Okay, I think that the student unrest came first. As you recall, there was considerable unrest on college campuses in the 70s throughout the country, much worse in some places than others. And when a new president was to be selected at UT, a group of students felt that there should be input from the student body, and they had a rally on the campus at the university.
Was this when Peter Paine was involved?
Yes. Fortunately for the university, there was a student named Peter Paine, K-A-M-I. He was from Brazil, and Paine was promptly pronounced commie, and the anti-communist forces seized upon that. And as a result of this rally, the Knoxville police, who were ready for any kind of student unrest, came out in battle gear, and there was a commotion on the campus.
And it was up on the so-called hill, was it?
It was on the hill, right next to the administration building.
I believe I can recall looking out of my then office at the law school, and there were those people all over the hill.
That's right. And they then arrested about 15 or more students and charged them with disorderly conduct and other things. And what had happened was, as a result of what was happening around the country, before this incident occurred, the legislature, in its wisdom, adopted a package of laws designed to prevent unlawful assembly of students. And they strengthened the disorderly conduct statutes, and there was one other statute that was very strange. And they were, when the student unrest occurred, they arrested these students and charged them under these statutes. The president of the student body was a young black man, the first black student to be president of the student body, Jimmy Baxter. And again, we were faced with students being arrested, held in jail, and going through the criminal process or doing something else. And we elected to do both. We defended some of the students in the criminal action. At the same time, we filed suit in federal court, convening a 3-judge federal court again to challenge the constitutionality of the statutes. We then got the state court to hold up the prosecution of the students pending an outcome of the constitutionality of the statutes. And Baxter versus Ellington, Governor Ellington, is a reported case, and we challenged the statutes, and we again had a 3-judge federal court, and 2 of the statutes were thrown out in total, and the disorderly conduct statute was massaged a little bit, and they took out some of the difficult sections.
Good.
And that led to the release of those students.
Yeah. And then was a separate situation where they had the, I believe Reverend Billy Graham came along with the president in the stadium. Tell us about that situation.
Well, apparently the president and his...
And about when was that, Bernie? I know it's
Again,
hard to
that's
get an
in the
exact year.
70s.
Yeah, early 70s, wasn't it?
Yeah. Billy Graham had a crusade using Neyland Stadium. And it ran, I think, for a week or two. And one night, the President of the United States was invited. And, of course, security was very tight. And many of the students wanted to protest the war in Vietnam. And they made, apparently, there was a gathering during the day, and they made signs and posters and so on to take with them into Neyland Stadium. The Secret Service, the police, etc., stopped the students, took away many of the signs. Students went into the stadium anyway. And during the course of the program, they tried to get attention by booing or whatever. And the police and the state troopers and the Secret Service and everybody else was very concerned. They kept looking up the student areas where they were sitting, taking movies and photographs and so on. And there was no physical violence of any kind, but over the next few days, they started going around campus, jerking students out of stores and out of dormitory rooms and arresting them for violating whatever it was they thought they were violating. And the students were charged, including, I think, 2 professors. And we wound up representing a number of those students and professors. And the cases ultimately were tried, and after a couple of years, they just went away.
One other matter in the constitutional area that seems to me of great importance, I've often thought what was then called the one man, one vote principle, now one person, one vote. The reapportionment cases, certainly in our state, may have had the most impact for the long term of anything else. And you've told me that you were not in the initial round of cases with regard to legislative reapportionment, but I believe you took that same principle and used it in some cases with local government. So tell us how that came about, those cases.
Well, it all stems from the case of Baker versus Carr, Carr being the Secretary of State of Tennessee. And that case got started, I think, even before I got to law school. And when I was in practice for just a few months, Hobart Atkins, who was one of the lawyers in that case, was a state senator, very fine lawyer, asked me to do some research, and I did some work on the one man, one vote principle, and that was it, basically. And then the case came back from the Supreme Court and established the concept that you had to give equal voting rights to people. And I was asked to look at the situation in one of the counties around here. I don't remember which county came first. But as a result of that, I was involved in the reapportionment of what was then called county court, now county commission, or county school board, for about 6 counties in and around Knox County. And that was very interesting because all of them were in federal court in front of Judge Taylor, except one, which was in a state chancery court. And we were dealing there with constitutional provisions in the Tennessee Constitution, which violated the federal Constitution in principle. So we tried to work out a way to resolve those issues without doing violence to the state Constitution. And I think we were generally successful. But it was interesting visiting with county courts and explaining to them what they had to do. And of course, everybody in those days hated the Supreme Court, and everybody wanted to impeach Earl Warren. So that was all part of the drama that went on at the time.
I want to ask about some of the other cases that I know you were involved in, but maybe since we've looked at a series of cases, many of which have involved very significant constitutional law issues, criminal law issues. Maybe this would be an appropriate time to take a break. We'll do that and come back and pick up with more of your career. Bernie, we're back from the break. Maybe before we get into some of the other major cases or types of cases you had, tell us a little bit about the developments from that one office situation at the Hamilton Bank as far as the firm that you obviously built up over the years.
Well, Charles Susano, who had been one of my students in law school and went on to become the first clerk for the Chief Justice of the Tennessee Supreme Court, came to work for me, and he was my first associate, and we had a very good relationship, and we worked together on a number of the cases that I've outlined. And then over the years, Boone Dougherty joined the firm, and Caesar Stair and Tom McAdams and Doris Allen and other people have come and gone, but we've not had much of a turnover. I think we deliberately have kept the firm small. We have 9 lawyers now, and no great desire to be any larger. We have lost the ability to represent some clients because we didn't have enough staff, but we like the idea that we're not overburdened with a large group of people, and it's worked out very well. Everyone has done well financially and otherwise. I think everybody's satisfied with the lives that we've all shared in the practice of law.
Yeah, your firm is about the same size as the one I'm affiliated with, roughly. Tell us about the career then after that of Charlie Susano. He went on to...
He went on to practice law on his own and left for a while to go into industry, came back to our firm, and I don't recall the sequence of events, but he then went on to the Court of Criminal Appeals. No, that's not right. He went on to the Court of Appeals, and he's a super judge doing a great job.
He sure is. Highly, highly regarded. He's been a very successful lawyer, and again, we were classmates at
then you know.
college. Yeah.
We're lucky to have people like that on our bench.
Did you enjoy the practice as a solo practitioner more, and you like working with other lawyers in the firm?
I think it's better to have other lawyers in the firm. You need the collegiality, you need the ability to fire questions at other people and try out ideas. And I've done that many times, and other people come to me and say, let me try some ideas on you, and I think that's important.
You never had the experience, and I suppose it's a good thing, of being, as many of my students over the college today must face this, of being the brand new lawyer in one of these large firms and having to hope to work your way up from the bottom. You never had to do that because you were your own lawyer, as they say, before you even formed a firm.
That's right. I was very fortunate. It worked. At the same time that I was doing that, so many of my friends from undergraduate days were in big New York and Philadelphia law firms. They never saw a client for the first 5 years they were in practice. They were relegated to writing briefs, and there I was slugging it out in court every day of my life and having people in the office, and they were crying and everything else. It was a very human practice.
Yeah. You were able to do what my father always admonished me to do, and he was finally able to do it after many decades himself, and that is to be his own boss. You were able to be your own boss at first because there wasn't anybody else. Tell me how you got involved with Mr. Jim Clayton, a very prominent businessman in this area.
Well, again, about 1959 or 60, Jim Clayton and his brother were running an automobile dealership called Clayton Motors, and they were heavily involved with bank financing from the old Hamilton Bank. And apparently some of the people they sold cars to were not paying for those cars, and the dealership was contingently liable, and Jim and his brother were contingently liable personally. And it looked like the bank was going to close them down. And his then lawyer came to see me on a Sunday and said, "I don't know anything about bankruptcy, and I've noticed you down in bankruptcy court. Can you help with this situation?" And so, lo and behold, in the next 2 days, we put together the bankruptcy of one of the large automobile dealerships in Knoxville, and that led to litigation that extended for several years.
And would this have been back in the 60s or
In
maybe
the 60s,
early
yeah,
60s?
early
Yeah.
60s. And Jim Clayton went on to become a lawyer, to go back in the automobile business, and then into the mobile home business. And our firm has represented the companies all these years. And of course, you know the end of the story. He went public, and just this year sold out to Warren Buffett at Berkshire Hathaway.
Yes, he was another of my classmates that did a little better than I did financially anyway. Did you work in your practice on weekends? How was it you were approached on a weekend?
Because I was there, he could find me, and he came over the house on a Sunday, and we talked about it. But in the old days, I used to work every Saturday and most nights. And my children were young, and I hated to be away from them. In the early days, our office was open on Saturdays.
Yes, I think that was typical in Knoxville.
Oh, yes, Saturday was a big day, a very big day. But then I think about the middle 70s, we started to close on Saturday, but I would sit outside on the patio and dictate and watch the kiddies run around and play and so on. So I was home with my children, but I was generally out there dictating.
You were involved in a case or cases involving botulism. Tell us how those cases arose, and about when would that have been?
I would think that period would have been in the middle 60s to the end of the 60s.
And what is botulism, by the way?
Botulism is a fatal disease brought about by ingesting tainted food. And the botulism toxin grows in the food, you ingest it, and it's fatal unless you can find a way to deter it. And there is an antitoxin, but it's not readily available. And several people in Knoxville and in Anderson County ate smoked whitefish that was sold at the Kroger store. And they ate it on Sunday, and by Monday morning, 2 were dead. And fortunately, a doctor who treated a child, it was a father and daughter who died. The doctor treating the child remembered something from his training, that it might be some toxin like botulism.
Was that Dr. Hill?
Dr. Oliver Hill here at Knoxville.
Pediatrician, who was one of my doctors growing
Right.
up. Yes.
And as a result of that, the diagnosis was made, and then the tainted fish was identified, and people were advised not to eat the fish because people could have bought it and had it in their refrigerator. And there were about a half dozen people involved, and actions were filed generally in federal court against Kroger's and against the trucking companies. And we spent a lot of time traveling around taking depositions. It was a major, major case. And we settled on behalf of our clients, I think, the day before the trial.
Another case or group of cases that did not turn out as well, I think it involved radiation over in Oak Ridge, Tennessee.
Yes, I was involved in a radiation case of a scientist who worked at the Oak Ridge facility from 1943 to 1945 on the electromagnetic process of extracting uranium-235 from uranium-238 to be used in the first atom bomb. And he was ill of a rare blood disorder, and the physician treating him thought that it might be related to possible exposure to uranium. And I was hired by his family, which included a very well-known scientist, and worked on that case for quite a while. And because of the fact that it was Oak Ridge, I had a top-secret clearance from my Air Force days. That seemed to satisfy them that I was not a risk, and they gave me the books that I needed and how to build an atom bomb, basically. And as a result of that, we spent a lot of time in depositions, including 2 days at the UN in New York. And we tried the case in federal court in front of Judge Taylor. You never like to talk about the cases you lose, but this is one I lost. The judge could not find causation between the exposure to radiation and his disease. If we were trying that case today, I have no doubt that we would win it. And that's evidenced by the fact that now we have federal legislation which enables people like that to file claims for exposure to radiation.
Well, you and I know if you try enough cases, the hard cases, you're certainly going to lose some of those. You and I were involved in, let me ask you this first. In those cases we've talked about it in the more recent years, which these are, were you working on by yourself, or were you using other folks? You mentioned that Charlie Susano was involved in some of the cases we discussed before the break, but I guess by the time of the botulism cases, the time of the radiation case, by that time had you gotten your firm growing a little bit? Did you have other lawyers with you?
I don't believe anybody worked on the radiation case. I think I did have some help on the botulism case, but I'm really not sure.
Okay. And later on, I take it, would it be routine that you usually had somebody working with you, or was that not the way it worked in the Bernstein firm?
That's not the way it worked. That's not the way it worked. We had too much work to do to have 2 or 3 lawyers. And in fact, it's kind of a joke around here when we get involved in a case and you see the other side show up with a half dozen lawyers. You wonder who's paying the bill. Yeah,
so Bernie Bernstein handled his cases, Charlie Susano handled his, and Cesar Steyer handled his.
That's basically it.
Okay. You and I dealt some with, I guess, the area of corporate law. Some of that involved malpractice as well, but I know one case we had together involved, I believe, a brokerage firm where you had the former broker-dealer and I had the firm. But tell us some, just in general terms, and any specifics you want to relate to us about your experience in the overall subject that we'll call corporate litigation.
Well, as a result of some of the cases that we've been talking about, and my experience in federal court particularly, and I think also my Wharton School background, I was hired in a number of corporate-type lawsuits and SEC matters. And I've represented directors of corporations who were sued for breach of fiduciary duties. I've represented brokerage firms who were accused of churning. I've represented corporate officials who have been accused of violating SEC rules and regulations. I've been involved in stockholder derivative actions. I've been involved in stockholder lawsuits, one group against another, many times trying to mediate disputes. Frequently occurs in small, closely held companies and family-owned corporations. And that's an ongoing area of the law that we've been involved in and continue to be involved in.
So in some of those cases, in contrast with the injury cases or death cases, you were many times on the defense side of the courtroom.
That's right.
Right.
I've never tried to make a distinction between a plaintiff's lawyer and a defense lawyer. I think the answer is who gets to the courthouse first to see
Yes.
who the plaintiff's lawyer or the defendant's lawyer.
You're a trial lawyer.
Yeah.
I know, again, from personal experience based on a case you and I had some years ago, that you have been involved in professional malpractice cases. The one we had involved accounting malpractice. I guess it had some securities issues involved as well. That was that the JetX case, I think the case.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
Where you
Yes.
represent the people from Colorado, and we spent a lot of time traveling around out there. And in fact, I believe I recall in that case that the carrier for my client, who was an accounting firm, and seemed like there was involved in it, not a hardwood lumber company across the mountain in North
Right.
Carolina. They used to make, I think at one time in history, virtually all the tractor trailer truck beds in the country. But I think I recall in that case that my client gave me authority for a pretty substantial amount, for those days at least, maybe exactly six figures, exactly $100,000. And I said, well, if you give me authority, I'm going to, Bernie's a lawyer I respect and my friend as well, I'm not going to play games and start at 90 and so forth. I said, I'm going to tell him he'd hold him out, and I got authority to do that. And I remember you said, I'll call you back in 15 minutes or something, and then we settled that case. And we've been talking about Judge Taylor a little bit, but do you recall, of course, that he had the rocket docket more than any judge in the United States? And he wanted to have the case set for trial such that neither you nor I could possibly get this very major case ready for trial, and I think we agreed to a non-suit or voluntary dismissal.
That's right.
Prepared the case, and then had it where we knew what the facts were and were able to settle the case. But tell me about the other types of professional malpractice that you got into, aside from this accounting malpractice case I talked too much about already.
I've represented lawyers in malpractice cases. I've represented accountants in malpractice cases, psychologists in malpractice cases, and for many years we did a lot of medical malpractice cases for one group in particular, and that's an interesting but troublesome area. You don't feel good if the defendant really has been guilty of malpractice. It's a tough defense.
It is. It really is. I think it's a compliment you were asked to represent lawyers in malpractice cases.
Well, that too is difficult. Members of the bar that you know and respect usually, and something goes wrong and they come to you for help.
And I think, am I right that now people are more apt to sue lawyers, whereas in the early days of our practice, maybe folks just didn't do it much?
That's right. And it was very difficult to find lawyers to do it.
Would do it.
Now there are lawyers that specialize in suing lawyers.
You have a reputation of representing folks in the high-octane divorce area. Tell us how you got involved in doing domestic work. Domestic relations work, I should say.
I didn't do much domestic relations work when I started to practice law. Somehow in the 1980s, I guess, people in business activities that we had some involvement with started engaging in divorces. You know, there's been an epidemic in divorces in this country and locally. And many of the people that came to see me were involved more so in trying to structure a division of business interests. So what starts out and looks like a divorce turns into a division of assets, substantial assets and business interests and so on. And I was involved in a few divorce cases where I wound up at the request of a client, going on the board of directors of companies to represent the wife in the divorce action. And, you know, that one case leads to another and so on. So we have a very substantial divorce practice here. My partner, Caesar Stair, devotes, I would say, 90% of his time to divorce work. And I'm still involved to a lesser extent, but they're all what we call major cases. It includes everything, tax issues and business interests and estate planning issues and so on.
Was that a type of practice you liked or at least found challenging?
I found it challenging, and I think as you get older, the way you're perceived is different too. You know, you're the older head and you know all about what happens when marriages fall apart and so on. Frankly, I'm not sure I know anymore because most of the clients are much younger, but they need help.
Did you not have some of those cases, though, where there were custody issues that were heart-wrenching?
Yes, I've tried many difficult custody cases. They're unhappy. I'm not happy with them. No one really wins. They think they do, but they don't.
Amen to that.
In fact, I've told all of my partners, don't take a custody case and try to change custody from a mother unless you think you've got an 80% chance of winning. Because if you lose, they never forget it, and there's hell to pay the rest of the child's minority and beyond.
Good point. You had, at one time, an industrial espionage case. I've never been involved in such. What is it, and what was the case about?
That was a case involving two very major American corporations. It's a reported case, and one of the company that we represented had a special technology that they possessed, and they learned that another company was going to go into that field. The other company hired away one of their managers, and lo and behold, that manager was observed busily copying blueprints that he had access to. And he went to work for the other company, and the other company built a plant in Tennessee. And my client's, one of the executives of my client, was found snooping around that plant, and lawsuits were brought charging us with industrial espionage. And these two companies really went to war. There were 5 suits pending around the United States, all resulting from this. And we were the first ones to come to trial in federal court in Greenville. And we had a case in the circuit court, I believe it was, of Unicoi County in Irwin at the same time. And one of the cases we won and went up to the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we won there, and ultimately the cases were all settled. If you give these things enough time, the technology changes, and after about 4 years, the technology was no longer significant. Didn't matter.
You must have had quite a workload. I know you've always worked very hard, at least in the experiences I've had with you. How did you handle such a load, seemingly, except for maybe the first months of your practice, but you seemingly had more business than most lawyers would be able to say grace over. How did you work your schedule out, and what were your work habits that enabled you to handle, especially the way that your firm did it, where you did pretty much what you brought in? How did you do that?
You know, we're all prisoners of our experience, and a significant experience for me was my Air Force experience, where I learned to dictate intelligence reports. I could dictate very quickly and I think very well. In my mind, I would have a picture of what I wanted to say and how the paragraphs would line up and so on. And as a result, when I started to practice law, I had dictating machines. Nobody else did in those days. And I can dictate very quickly, and frequently I can dictate. I'd leave court in Greenville and dictate a brief or something else in the car on the way back. And I think I work very fast, and that has helped me handle all the things that I have in the mill at one time.
Did you, in your work, as far as the kind of work, and you did so much, we'll talk about a little bit more of it here momentarily, but I think you told me, and we were chatting early this morning, that you enjoyed the chancery practice more than any other. Is that right?
Yes.
And why is that?
Well, chancery, again, in the early days, didn't have the same restrictions that a circuit court trial had. And in chancery court, you had an opportunity to engage with the chancellor much more so than in a jury trial. You don't engage with a jury, really. And I thought it was more challenging. And all the business cases that we would put in chancery court. And because of the situation in federal court, our chancery court for many years handled not all, but a great many cases that should have been brought in federal court. And I just like chancery practice.
I think you're right. I think some of the cases were not in federal court just because lawyers in this area preferred the chancellors to being over in federal court. And I'll say for the record, too, one of the things that made you such an able, even dangerous adversary is you had a way, especially with chancellors, of going in and what I would say taking over the courtroom. You'd be telling the judge, here's what we really need to do in this case, and the judge would think that was a very good idea, and the rest of us would finally be begging to get a word in edgewise, and we also had a client in this fight too, but you were very, very good in the way that you handled yourself in chancery court. I've never seen your equal in that, of getting the court to do your bidding, which was a good skill to have for sure. I want to get in, of course, to the Butcher Bank empire, but let me ask you, first of all, you apparently have dealt with banks and bank directors in your practice. How did that area of practice develop for you?
I never heard, really, of bank director lawsuits until the Hamilton Bank Shares case in Chattanooga, which was a very major bank failure. And a local banker in Knoxville happened to be on the board of Hamilton Bank Shares, and he came to me to represent him when he and the other directors were sued. And that was a case pending before Judge Frank Wilson in the Federal District Court in Chattanooga.
Very fine federal judge, for sure.
Right. And in those days, there were very few cases on the books after about 1935. When the banks failed in the 30s, you found cases, but nothing after that. And so it was uncharted area, and that case lasted for several years, and then the C&C Bank of Campbell County was taken over by the FDIC, and that was the first Butcher-controlled bank to fail. And again, I was hired to represent one of the directors, and all the defense lawyers got together in that case, and we employed an investigator and told him what we wanted him to do, and we issued subpoenas for bank records. And we discovered that there were bank loans being transferred from one Butcher bank to the other when they came due and couldn't be paid. It was a round robin. So we actually saw the failure of the Butcher banks that was coming. And when the United American Bank, which was controlled by Jake Butcher, failed in Knoxville, I was convinced that all the banks were going to fail because they all had the same bad loans that we had discovered in Campbell County.
Really?
And sure enough, that's what happened. And since we were not involved representing the butchers, we got calls to be involved in any number of cases. We had a rule in the office: no one would take a case until we could sit down at the end of the day and talk about it, because of possible conflicts.
Conflicts, certainly.
So we wound up representing the creditors committee in the Southern Industrial Banking case.
And was that C.H. Butcher,
That
the
was
brothers'
a
bank?
CH-controlled bank. And then we also represented United American Leasing Corporation, which was a leasing company controlled by United American Bank, Jake Butcher's bank. And those two cases kept many of us busy for several years. And we also represented directors who were sued by the FDIC in both the C&C Bank of Knox County and I believe the Knox Federal Savings and Loan, which is another Butcher-controlled bank.
I'd forgotten about that one. Yes. And had you, in your work in the community and so forth, which I'm going to get to, had you known the Butchers over the years, or just knew who they were?
I knew who they were. The father of the Butchers called me one day to help a woman who needed a lawyer. I really didn't know the father, but he referred this woman to me, and that was it.
Well, they certainly had an impact on Knoxville both ways. I mean,
Oh yes, oh yes.
in the good times, and then later what became the very, very bad times. Let me ask you to tell about, to some extent, I know you're modest about this, but I want to try to pull it out of you, some about your activities in the community. I know you, from my recollection, fairly early on became active in various things. Tell us some of the things that you did that you're proudest of as far as community activities.
Well, most recently, I think my work on the, as chairman of the, what was called the Bernstein Commission, was very rewarding and gratifying.
Okay, what caused that commission to be formed? By way of background.
In 1998-99, 4 black youths were killed while in police custody. And I think the city in general, but the black community in particular, were very concerned about how this could happen. And there were some strange circumstances. And there were demands by various groups for the city to do something about it. And Mayor Ash called me and met with me and asked me if I would head up a blue ribbon commission to determine if there was a way to establish some kind of a citizens review committee dealing with police. And he appointed, and I agreed, and he appointed me as chairman, and then he appointed, I think, 9 or 10 members from the community. And we held hearings about every 2 weeks and invited experts to come talk to us, and police to talk with us, and community leaders to talk with us, and law professors to talk with us. And we took testimony, basically, for about 6 months on ideas that were being floated around as to how to involve some kind of a citizens group in dealing with police brutality, if that's the key word. And as a result of those hearings and our meetings, we put together a proposal for the formation of a police advisory and review committee, which is now called PARC. And that was adopted by executive order of the mayor, and an executive director was appointed to advise that committee. And it's now established by ordinance in the city of Knoxville. And it's proved to be very successful. And it's been copied by other cities as well. It's particularly useful for a city our size, which cannot afford to have another investigative body in addition to the police department.
Now, how did you balance your practice with devoting what obviously was considerable time to this, for example, community endeavor, that being the Bernstein Commission?
You just have to make room. You push things aside, you reschedule things. Most clients were proud of the fact that I was doing this and supported the effort. And everybody knew it was important for the community to try to get a handle on this. And I think the members of the black community that I dealt with had faith that I was going to be fair.
I don't doubt
And
that.
a lot of them came to see me privately. A number of ministers came to see me. And I assured them that we were going to do what had to be done without telling them what we were going to do, because I didn't know at the time. And that seemed to work.
Did you come away from that experience with a different idea about Knoxville, for example, or the community we live in?
Not a different idea, but I was again impressed with the fact that there is a huge difference in economic groups in our city. And I'm not sure that we are doing enough to encourage people themselves to change the way they live and what they do and to improve their lot.
You've been active, I believe, in the UT Hospital and Medical Center. How did you get involved with that activity?
Oh, about 10 years ago, I was asked to serve on an advisory committee to the Board of Trustees of the university, who at that time had the ultimate governance responsibility for the University of Tennessee Hospital and Medical Center in Knoxville. And after several years on that advisory committee, the university, for its own reasons, decided they wanted to get out of the hospital business. And so the leadership of the university decided that they would seek legislation to enable them to transfer the university hospital in Knoxville to a nonprofit corporation. And I was asked to serve on the committee on behalf of this to-be-formed nonprofit corporation. And I did, and what happened was we actually worked out a method for the state and the university to sell the hospital to a nonprofit corporation, the nonprofit corporation to take it over, subject to an obligation to run the Graduate School of Medicine here in Knoxville, and subject to the requirement of giving state benefits or the equal of state benefits to the then existing employees and leasing the campus. And we've done that, and I was asked to serve as the chairman of the board, and I've done that now for the past 4 years. And that's been a very rewarding experience and takes a lot of time as well.
Was that a matter of on-the-job learning to do that, or did you go into that?
I don't do
project?
surgery, Don.
I know that, but as far as being able to somehow work out this change, and I knew vaguely about that, but I really didn't know that UT Hospital had done that until you explained it to me.
Yes. You know, being a lawyer, you're exposed to all kinds of business involvement and so on. I never heard the word nonprofit or nonprofit accounting in my years at the Wharton School. Nonprofits never existed in anybody's mind, yet it's a huge area of activity. And the rules are different. The accounting is different and everything else. Even the governance is different. So it's been a challenge, but it's been worthwhile.
Is the Helen Ross McNabb Center part of the hospital or affiliated in some way?
No connection at all.
Okay, it just happens to be located in the same area?
It was.
Okay.
As of about 6 months ago, they've left the campus of the University of Tennessee Hospital, and we now have that space and are remodeling it, as a matter of fact.
Okay. Tell us, going back to the first case we talked about, that I believe the proprietor of the Gateway Bookstore was a Mr. Werner.
That's right.
And how did that come full circle with his involvement with the Helen Ross McNabb Center? I believe he was the client that started out giving you $15.
$15 to look at a lease. He went on to create a chain of bookstores and card shops, about 130 bookstores and maybe 100 card shops all over the country, and we represented him for about 30 years, I guess. And he ultimately sold the bookstores to one company and the card shops to another company, and retired and lives in this area. And he was a major financial supporter of the Helen Ross McNabb Mental Health Center.
Mm-hmm. So some of these small clients to begin with became very big clients. That being true also, of course, of Mr. Clayton.
That's right. That's right.
I know you represented very early on the Profits store. What did that amount to when you were first involved with them?
Well, I got involved representing the developer of Westtown Shopping Center. That was the first regional shopping center in this area, and worked on that for about 3 years, doing things that I'd never done before, you know, major mortgage documents and things like that. And one of the tenants was Profits Department Store, and I worked on their lease, and they were represented by other attorneys, of course. And when it was over, they came to me and asked if I could be their lawyer, and I had to get permission from the developer, which I got, and I started representing the Profits. And they grew into a regional department store, and I represented them all those years. And then the Profits family sold out, and the new owner, Brad Martin from Memphis, asked me if I would go on the board that he was setting up, and the company was going to become a publicly held company. And I did, and that company then acquired other companies, and today it's Saks Fifth Avenue, plus 5 major department store chains around the country, and I'm a member of the board and chairman of the audit committee of that company.
And another store or store chain, Goodies. How did you get involved with Goodies?
Well, that's a more difficult topic to describe, but there were some suits against the directors and officers, and I was hired to represent director and officers of that company, and that led to other litigation. And a few years back, there was a major conflict between the board of directors and the chairman of the board of the company, and I represented the chairman of the board and his family in that case, and we got it resolved successfully.
Good. Anybody from Knoxville remembers Whittle Communications that no longer exists, and I believe you were involved in that too. How did you become involved as a lawyer with Whittle?
Well, if you recall, that company was called Approach 1330 when it started, and later became Whittle Communications. And it was started by a group of newly graduated students at the University of Tennessee who had no money. And they came to see me one day and asked me if I would help them, and they explained they had no money, but if they were successful, they would pay the fees. And they were engaging young men and women, and I thought it was a terrific challenge, and I was hooked and represented them, I would guess, for 3 or 4 years without ever getting a penny. And then the company turned successful, and we continued to represent them for many years. And I spent probably 1.5 years working on assembling the property and putting it together for the construction of their headquarters, and that headquarters is now the United States District Court here in Knoxville.
Beautiful building, it really is. Williamsburg-style building. I want to ask also about your involvement, Bernie, in the synagogue. Tell us something about the history of that particular organization and how you became active in it, and any particular positions that you later came to hold in the synagogue.
Well, the synagogue, of which I'm a member in Knoxville, has been here since probably 1890. And I served on the board for about 30 years, and I was chairman of the board of trustees, and I was also president of the synagogue, and found that to be a very challenging and worthwhile endeavor.
Was that Barbara's church, or where her family had gone to begin with?
Barbara's grandfather came to Knoxville in 1895 from Omaha, Nebraska, and he was the first permanent Orthodox rabbi in Knoxville and led the congregation until about 1925. And Barbara's family was involved all those years and continues to be involved now.
And Barbara, your wife, I believe, is one of the leading historians, I guess, of the Jewish community. Is that an accurate statement?
Well, she has, as a result of being one of the first families here, she has a wealth of historical information, and she's been active in setting up the archives of the Jewish community of Knoxville.
Did you ever feel in your legal work any challenge because you were a member of the Jewish community and you were in an area where most of the people in Knoxville are of a different faith? Was that ever a factor one way or the other that you felt?
I think it works both ways. I think there are a number of people that have come to see me thinking that somehow because I'm Jewish, maybe I'm brighter or more adept or something. And some of them have even said it. Most don't say it but may feel it. On the other hand, there are others who have said disparaging things, either to me or to others about me, because of my particular faith. I had it used against me once in a jury case in federal court where the closing argument made by the other side was clearly designed to remind the jury that the lawyer for the plaintiff was Jewish, and it was an out-and-out appeal to prejudice. The jury went out and came back after an hour and wanted to know if they could give the plaintiff, my client, more money than we had sued for.
That's beautiful.
So I thought that was an interesting development.
That is. That's heartwarming. That's nice.
And Judge Taylor picked up on it, and after the case was over, he made it a point to chew out the other lawyer for what he had done.
Well, good. I mean, he was good on chewing all of us, and in that case, it was deserved.
Yes.
In contrast with some of the others, I want to talk some too, in our remaining time, about the many activities you've had in our profession with respect to the organized bar. I guess first, why have you been involved so heavily as you have been in the organized bar? My impression is, especially in this day and time, and even earlier than now, that a lot of your colleagues and mine don't seem to have any interest in that at all. Why were you motivated that way?
I think I was thrust into it. Again, when I started to practice, there were only about 6 of us who stayed in Knoxville from my class or the classes around me and practiced, and the Bar Association used to use one of the young lawyers as a secretary. And I was asked to be secretary of the bar, and that was interesting work, I thought. And I went to the meetings every month of the Board of Governors, and before you knew it, I'd been secretary for about 5 years and then treasurer. And then somebody suggested that I ought to be put up for president. And I didn't make it the first time around, but I did the second, and I was elected president. I was very young, and it was a very challenging experience. And also in the years prior to being president, Arnold Kramer had been president one year, and he got involved in a major merger and acquisition matter, so he was out of town most of the time. And he would call me and say, can you handle this for me or that for me for the Bar Association? And they were very responsible tasks, and I learned how to do it. So I felt good about it. Also, I think the collegiality was very important back then. We would go to lunch, and you'd sit down with 8 lawyers, and that represented all the young lawyers in Knoxville. And we felt for each other. We were all trying to scratch out a living, and we felt good about it. And again, we knew everyone's wives, we knew their children, and so on.
And you ultimately were given the highest award that our association gives, that being the Governor's Award. I think you were one of the early recipients of that award, and well deserved. You also remained active with the University of Tennessee College of Law. We know about your work with the clinic, but I know that you did other work. What was your continuing involvement with the law school?
Well, as I say, I believe I was on staff for about 8 years, and then after that I was asked to come over and talk to classes on professionalism from time to time and other things, and I was involved with fundraising. I was state chairman one year for fundraising, for a major fundraising drive. Howard Baker was the national chairman, and we worked together on that. And I'm very proud of UT Law School and proud of the work they do.
And I believe they gave you the Alumni Award from that college, is that correct?
Yes.
Right. In the in our profession, tell us some about, putting modesty aside a minute, tell us a little bit about some of the memberships you've had in organizations, other than, of course, the Knoxville Bar we talked about, and also the professional legal organizations that you're in, both elected and otherwise.
Well, I'm a member of all the bar associations: Knoxville, Tennessee American Bar, Trial Lawyers Association. I got elected to the American College of Trial Lawyers as a fellow, and the American Bar Foundation as a fellow. I think those are the two major areas. I've been listed in the publication, I forget the name of it, America's Best Lawyers or something like that. They send you a plaque to hang on your wall for $5 or so.
Best Lawyers in America.
Best Lawyers in America,
Exactly.
That's it, yeah.
And, of course, a member of the Tennessee Bar Foundation as well.
Yes, Tennessee.
Fellow.
Oh, absolutely a fellow.
The group that has us here.
Yes.
We had to talk about politics, and I don't want to get involved with your persuasion there, but I know that you at one time were affiliated with a constitutional convention. How did that come to be?
Yes, in 1977, we had a limited Tennessee Constitutional Convention, and it came at a time when both of my children were in college, and I decided that I knew as much about the Tennessee Constitution law as anybody I knew, and that I could afford to take the time away from my practice to serve in a constitutional convention if I could get elected. And I turned and I talked to my partners, and they said, sure, go for it. And I turned to Victor Ashe, who was then a state senator, and I said, how do I go about getting elected? And he wrote out the game plan, and he was right on target. And I went through the election process and campaigned and got elected, and went to Nashville thinking that I'd be there for a month at the most to rewrite the Constitution, and wound up being there for almost 5 months. And that was a very interesting experience.
And you were there, I guess, for weekdays. You were there.
I was there from Monday through Thursday of every week.
And really could not keep your practice going, but for your partners at that time.
And the telephone and dictating machines. Again, driving back and forth, I could dictate.
Did that give you any idea you wanted to run for public office, other than that function you were performing then?
No, I didn't have the urge to run for any other public office. This was a very specialized activity. I felt I could do it. When I got there, I was right at home, trying to figure out how to amend the Constitution, how to make it fit together, and so on. I felt right at home. But I've never had the urge to run for any other office.
I know a lot of lawyers would like to have seen you as a trial judge or appellate judge, maybe on the Tennessee Supreme Court, maybe a Tennessee chancellor. Have you ever had any thoughts about being a judge?
Well, I've had thoughts, but they've passed over. I was asked to serve as a special master in federal court, which I did early on, tried a case for a couple of days, and then I sat as a special judge in Chancery Court when Judge Broughton was ill. And lo and behold, the case I tried got appealed to the Court of Appeals, and luckily I was upheld. So I can say I've never been reversed in my judicial career, but I've been urged at different times to put my name forth, but I didn't want to do it.
And in those few cases where you were the acting chancellor, special chancellor, did you enjoy those experiences?
I enjoyed it, but I enjoy the other side of the bench even more, being an advocate. And I think being a judge is a very lonely profession. You have to have the right temperament for it and so on. And I wasn't sure I was ready for that.
I get the impression you would not have wanted to be just an office lawyer exclusively in your career. You wanted to be in the courtroom some. Is that correct?
I think that's true, yes.
And I think overall you've enjoyed your life as a trial lawyer.
That's true. I don't think anybody can try cases unless you really like it, because the toll is enormous. You live with it, you sleep with it, you eat it, you drink it. It's part of your being.
Let's talk about some of the members of the bar that you found to be influential in your career, maybe mentors or at least some role models that you looked up to, particularly in your younger days at the bar.
Well, I was helped by so many people. Again, because the number of people in the bar was so small. There were only about 300 lawyers, and it stayed that way for about 10 years. And we were all pretty close, and everybody was very helpful. Richard Stair Sr. in particular was my neighbor in the Hamilton Bank building, and he was very, very helpful and a very fine lawyer. Foster Arnett was another neighbor of mine. He was not as helpful, but he was a challenge, and we had a lot of fun together. I was assisted enormously by the Fowler Roundtree firm, which had the best library in the building. And this big corporate banking law firm enabled me as a young pipsqueak lawyer to use their library in my civil rights cases, which was always interesting. And they were helpful.
I remember that library. It was, I suppose, the best law library, at least outside the university, that we had in this city, as I recall.
I think their library and the Kramer
Yes,
library were the two best libraries around. And the Kramer library was also made available to me at different times. And of course, going up to the UT library was a possibility, and the Supreme Court library was always there.
When, by the way, did you and your firm move from the Hamilton Bank building to your present location here?
I think it was 1976 or 7 that we moved across the street to the old Farragut Hotel building and redid it.
And so that's the same office space that we're in
We've
today?
been here on the 6th floor all these years.
And was that about the time they opened this building to office space?
Yes. Yes.
I thought that was right. I thought you were one of the very first ones. Let me, let me ask you something. I don't know if you've pondered or not. I've tried not to, speaking for myself, but are you going to retire from the law practice one of these days?
That's a very tough decision. I haven't been able to deal with it, frankly. I tried to reduce my workload, and it turns out that if I reduce in one area, it picks up in another area. So, I don't go to certain courts anymore, and yet the cases in the other courts keep me twice as busy. I've been very unsuccessful in figuring out a way to reduce my workload.
I know my father never seemed to have any hobbies outside of work and doing things on the farm when he was at the home place, but do you have any hobbies and such that you might explore or interests you might explore if you were to retire as practicing law pretty much your life.
It's about 90% of the things that I do are law-related, and I enjoy reading a great deal. And I'm a devotee of books on tape.
So am I.
I listen to a book a month probably on the average, and I cover all walks of life and all areas of interest, and I enjoy that very much. And we have a place at Hilton Head that we like to run away to from time to time. And I like walking on the beach and riding my bicycle on the beach and things like that.
Oh, good.
And of course, I'm devoted to UT football and basketball every year, so that takes a lot of my time.
I remember still with appreciation many years ago when my son was quite young, you would always give me several of your tickets so I could take my son and one of his friends over there. Is there anything in your law practice today that you most enjoy? If we had a case come in the office right now, what would you like it to be as far as your interest and pleasure?
I would like it to be challenging, something that hadn't been done before, and that would require spending a lot of time thinking through it and planning out the strategy for how to handle the case.
Because I get the impression in some of those early cases included, maybe especially those, that you had to do the research because nobody in town had ever taken one of those cases before. Nobody in town would take one of those cases, so that must have been a challenge. Is there any area, Bernie, that I haven't asked you about that you want to discuss with us?
Well, I think that in my years in practice, there's been a change in the practice of law and a change in how lawyers are perceived. In some areas we've improved, in other areas we've not. Despite all our efforts to improve the image of lawyers and all the campaigns that we've had over the years, I really don't see a difference in the mind of the public, which is troublesome to me, and I don't know how to resolve that one. I'm very fond of lawyers. I think lawyers are marvelous public servants, and we keep democracy running. I believe in that. And as long as the courthouse door is open, justice will be served. And any effort to stop that is wrong. Sometimes we go overboard and we're rude when it comes to the legal system. You know, impeach Earl Warren was a canard, and a lot of people subscribe to that. But they're really challenging our system. And I think it's up to lawyers to stand up for the system and make it work. And
if we were to go over next semester to this college where you've given so much of your time and talk to my part-time class, which will be made up of first-year law students, is there anything you would tell them about how they should approach their education and the practice? And since they're first years, they're still subject maybe to some influence. Anything you would pass on to them as a senior member of our profession?
I always told the students in my days that they were required to read a newspaper every day. I think it's important that lawyers be aware of what's going on in life around them, and they should start as law students. And I would also tell them that within 2 or 3 years after they leave the College of Law, they're going to become leaders in their communities, in their churches, in various activities, and they have to be the ones to help lead society. I believe in that. Just look around at the lawyers in Knoxville and the activities that they lead and the churches that they advise and lead and so on.
How would you like to be remembered by your brothers and sisters at the bar and by the community that you've served? What would be the thing you have, I guess, been proudest of, and the thing you want us to remember you for?
Well, it's an awfully broad question. I would like to think that Mr. Greenlee would thank me for saving his life if he's still around. But I think that I'd like to be remembered for doing my job well, helping a lot of people, and maybe advancing justice a little bit further than it was when I started. Mm-hmm. And that's a good feeling.
Well, I'll tell you this, Bernie, as we conclude this interview, and I mean this very sincerely, as your daughter knows, I requested that I be allowed to be your interviewer. And I've said this over and over again to people, lawyers and non-lawyers, that the best lawyer I've ever known is Bernie Bernstein. And that comes from the bottom of my heart, and I appreciate your being my mentor, and it's been a privilege to be with you today.
Well, you're very kind, and I
thank you.
appreciate what you've said.